Okay.
I just triggered it myself. I don't know if I triggered it for Zoom or for me.
Okay, we're ready to begin.
Great. So good evening from Paris, and thank you for joining us for this virtual discussion on understanding global challenges to democracy. My name is Kate Panzer, and I'm co-president of the Princeton Alumni Association of France. I'm delighted to welcome our speakers, Princeton alumni Richard H. Pildes and Michael Otten, who will discuss how best to understand the challenges to democracies across the West and political reforms to combat extremism in the United States. Just to give a brief introduction of our esteemed speakers, Richard H. Pildes is the Sudler Family Professor of Constitutional Law at NYU and one of the leading scholars of legal issues concerning democracy and the structure of American government. He's an author of the casebook, The Law of Democracy, and editor of The Future of the Voting Rights Act, and he's written nearly 100 articles on the rise of political polarization in the United States, political reforms to combat extremism, the effects of social media on democracy, among many other subjects. President Biden appointed him to the President's Commission on the Supreme Court of the United States. Professor Pildes has also been elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Law Institute, and he has received recognition as a Guggenheim Fellow and a Carnegie Scholar. He clerked for Judge Abner J. Mikva of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit and for Justice Thurgood Marshall of the U.S. Supreme Court. Michael Otten is co-founder of Reform Elections Now and the Green Chimneys Institute in Brewster, New York, an adjunct professor of international business management at EFRI and a mentor at INSEAD in France and Singapore. He was president of the Scarsdale Schools and Green Chimneys School and Children's Services Boards. His 30+ years with IBM included managing technology development and business planning for Europe, Asia Pacific, and Latin America. He co-authored and guest taught a technology and management class at Harvard. He was on the Harvard NY Community Partners Board and led a civic engagement consulting effort for the president of Kingsborough College, CUNY. He served on a distinguished alumni international economics panel at Princeton and judged entrepreneurship competitions at Ashoka NYU and INSEAD. He has technical degrees from Princeton, Columbia, and American universities and a Harvard MBA. He's currently spearheading an electoral reform movement in the United States with Reform Elections Now. I'll now give the floor to Richard and Mike, who will be happy to take your questions following their discussion. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Kate. And I should mention your co-president, Elise, I know, who's been very helpful in putting this together. And I guess it's evening, morning, or afternoon, depending on what time zone people are in. And one of the things I'll do, perhaps when we are just a little further into the program, is survey where people are currently residing or have been residing, because many of us have dual residences, which is one of the characteristics, I think, of the kind of population we could get on a call like this. I think for those who are on the call, please use the raise hand function if you want to join into the conversation directly, either with questions or comments from your own experience. We know that there are many in the audience who can share insights that are valuable from what they've already dealt with, being either in Europe or having had the interest in what's evolved politically in any of the countries. Rick, I really appreciate your joining us tonight to discuss the challenges to democracies, and most importantly, to describe ways we can reverse some of the negative trends. While often useful to move from generalities to specifics, I'd like to start out with a question about a specific success that you were directly involved with before going on to the more general problems facing Western democracy. Could you describe for us some of the late legal concerns that led up to the turmoil in Washington, D.C. on January 6, 2021? And more importantly, how over the last 2 years, a bipartisan coalition of over a dozen senators from each of the Democratic and Republican parties formed to enact remedial legislation with significant input from the academic community, including yourself as a principal advisor?
Sure, Mike. I'm happy to start off with that set of issues. First of all, let me thank you and Paris for putting this together. I'm a very proud Princeton alum, I guess also a proud Harvard Law School alum. But I'm always happy to talk to graduates from both of those schools that I have this very warm association with. So let me start by saying, among the most explosive issues any democratic system deals with is disputes over the resolution of the election for the highest ranking chief executive officer in the system. These are often moments at which democratic systems that are more fragile break down. They are very, very dangerous moments. They frequently trigger violent conflict. And in the United States, before 2020, the most disputed presidential election we had in our history was in the aftermath of the Civil War and Reconstruction in 1876, the Rutherford B. Hayes, Samuel Tilden, 1876 election. The 2000 election disputes pale in comparison to both 1876 and to 2020, as it turns out. And one of the things the dispute in 1876 revealed is that the Constitution didn't have any clearly set forth mechanism for resolving potential disputes that arose in the context of the presidential election. Back then, there were legitimate and significant and very real disputes about what the vote count was in at least 3 significant states. This was, again, a period of great violence in U.S. history. The federal government still had troops occupying much of the former Confederacy. There was vote fraud, vote suppression, a lot of manipulation. And so what happened in 1876 is that Congress created at the last minute an ad hoc commission to help it resolve disputes over the 1876 election. It was a 15-member commission, 5 senators, 5 representatives, 5 Supreme Court justices, and Congress basically agreed to be bound by the judgment of that commission, unless there was so much consensus in Congress in both chambers to overturn that judgment. And so at the end of the day, that commission did resolve the election and determined that Hayes had won that election. In the aftermath of that, it was widely agreed that this was a terrible ad hoc way of trying to resolve a potential dispute like this. And so Congress debated for over a decade and then eventually created this framework statute called the Electoral Count Act to try to regularize potential disputes in the presidential election process when the votes in different states were put in question. And that statute basically was there for more than 100 years and hadn't really come into play, except in very marginal contexts where nothing dramatic was at stake until 2020. And those of us who had studied this law, knew that there were a lot of anachronisms in the law. There were a lot of potential points of vulnerability. There was a lack of clarity when clarity is really essential. And many of those vulnerabilities, there was an attempt to exploit many of those vulnerabilities in 2020, including issues about, what power the vice president had when Congress was receiving these electoral votes to make any substantive judgments about whether the votes from particular states were problematic for one reason or not. And we sort of barely got through that. But that put this statute back, under the spotlight. And there was fairly broad recognition that there were major problems with this. And we didn't want to go through this process again without trying to modernize and clarify some of those problems. But nothing in Congress is easy these days. Everything requires getting past the filibuster. So it requires at least that level of bipartisan support. And particularly for this statute that regulates what Congress should do when it receives the electoral votes, if there are any disputes, it's very important that there be bipartisan buy-in to how that statute is designed and how it's going to work, because that's basically how it gets enforced. Congress agrees to be bound by the terms of the statute. Anyway, a number of us academics who had expertise in this area got very anxious and concerned that Congress was not doing anything after the first year or so of the Biden administration to deal with this statute. And and the time seemed to be kind of running short to effectively address this. So we put together a bipartisan group of academic experts and started writing public pieces, laying out how we thought the statute should be fixed and the roadmap that we thought Congress should follow in fixing it. And fortunately, as difficult as things are in Congress these days, there was enough recognition, particularly in the Senate, that this had to be addressed, that a bipartisan ad hoc group of senators got together, formed a group of about 16 of them, led by Susan Collins and Joe Manchin, and went to work on trying to put together a new version of the statute. One of the things that was very gratifying, I have to say, about being involved in this process is that the various interest groups that are often mobilized around voting issues were not really engaged in this issue. They had their focus on other kinds of concerns. And so it was a fairly unique situation in which a significant number of people in Congress knew they had to do something to fix this, knew it was too technical, that they didn't really understand it all that well, and therefore were fairly open to hearing from if they viewed a bipartisan group of academics as credibly, independent, thoughtful, and all that, they were very open to listening. We did play a significant role in drafting the new version of the statute. And then it was touch and go as to whether it would actually be passed. And it only came up it was really the very last thing Congress did in the lame duck session before the new Congress was seated in January. It had to be attached to the major spending bill, the omnibus bill as it was called, in order to get through, but it did get through. And I think it's a major achievement actually on Congress's part. It is a recognition that there are still opportunities for bipartisan legislation sometimes in Congress. I think being too cynical about that is a mistake, though you have to be realistic, about where those opportunities lie. And I think the statute has made the 2024 presidential election process more secure. And I can mention, several of the reasons or the ways in which the statute does that if you think there's interest in that. But that's sort of the story about where we started, why this is such an explosive, dangerous situation, why we need clear rules in advance for how to resolve any disputes that might arise, and why it was essential for Congress to step back up to the plate, which it hadn't done since the late 19th century, to help create a secure and stable framework for potential disputes in 2024. There are still lots of things to worry about, in my view, concerning the 2024 election in the United States, in terms of the integrity of the process, potential manipulation of the process. Fixing this statute doesn't take all of those problems off the table or all those concerns, but it does, on one very major front, make a very positive contribution for future presidential elections, not just 2024.
Thank you, Rick. I think that's an interesting experience that we all went through. And I know that some of our business-oriented and other alumni groups did quite a few sessions engaging groups across the country to try to talk to their senators and congressmen to make sure that the priority was recognized for this provision.
That's actually an important point. I want to hone in on that for a second, Mike, because one of the things that we know from the breakdown of democracies in other countries, or the risk when countries seem to be moving in that direction, one of the things we know is that the business community can be a very important force in trying to, help sustain the integrity of the democratic process, support the democratic process, Business, of course, has a stake, like all of us do, but in a stable and secure democratic process, a process in which the peaceful transfer of power takes place. And one of the things that was both interesting and gratifying in the work on the Electoral Count Act reform was the extent to which business groups and business leaders recognized this and decided to get involved in various ways, trying to push Congress about the urgency of this reform. And I think that made a difference with Congress. I remember talking to various groups after they had had their members speak to people on the Hill. And one of the things they were frequently asked by staff members is, why is business here on this issue? We don't expect to see you here on Electoral Count Act reform. And so I think that carried weight. And one of the things that we're trying to do going forward for 2024, one effort I'm involved in here is to help establish what we call pillars of the community in various battleground states and counties where we know there may be likely disputes about the election process in 2024. These pillars of the community include business leaders, faith leaders, education leaders, who will be brought into the election process relatively early on. They get exposed to election administrators, they learn how the system works, and they become hopefully in a spot where they can credibly bolster the legitimacy of the system, assuming it's working as it should, that they are credible people in their communities to help explain why the process is working the way it is, and to fight back on various, rumors, conspiracy stories, and the like that we have every reason to believe will continue.
I'd like to build on that and aim at your particular community. I think there's also a huge role that the academics can play, again, as somewhat nonpartisan and objective players in terms of bringing about change and recognizing that political scientists and educators in government should sometimes come out of their ivory towers, not on a partisan basis, but on a nonpartisan basis, to talk about what theories work best in terms of governance and elections and things that make our process work better. Our group originally was going to call ourselves Make Government Work, because that was what we were really worried about, is that government wasn't getting its job done. And then we found that elections seemed to be one of the key levers to do that. So that's why we came around to that particular heading. Let's shift gears and talk a little bit about the more global turmoil in democracies and get your view on what you think are the major causes, and particularly whether or not the liberal populism is in retreat, as some people think, or is continuing to gain ground as it has during recent years.
Yeah, so some very, very big questions there, of course. And I do think, in the US, we tend to be very inward focused and think that what we're seeing and experiencing in the US is unique to the US. I've always tried to situate developments here in the larger context, particularly of Western European democracies. And I do think over the last, 10 to 15 years, the Western democracies have mostly been going through fairly similar kinds of processes with fairly similar major political issues driving those processes. And it can be a little hard to see some of the similarities, because in the US, we have our two-party system, and many of the European systems, they have multi-party democracy and parliamentary systems. But I do think you see global sort of continuities. And the overall picture is one of continual dissatisfaction with democratic governments, whatever their composition has been over the last 10 to 15 years. No matter who's in power, we see growing public alienation, disaffection with the major political parties that have dominated politics for a long time in these countries, with traditional political leaders, with a sense that the system is just not responsive or responding to some of the dominant concerns of large numbers of citizens. The constant search for new alternatives, new options, and then the disaffection with these new options as they go into power. I mean, France, just to speak specifically about France, and people who are there will have much more familiarity with the story than I do. But France is one example of this, of course, with the complete collapse of the longstanding two major center-right and center-left parties that had dominated French politics since World War II. The fact that Macron was able to create his own political party almost out of nothing in the first election he won because of how much disaffection there was with the leadership of the two major parties. The fact that neither of those parties, which had so long dominated French politics, were able to get a candidate into the second and final round of the presidential election the last two times around. Macron becomes the figure fixed on to cut through all of this dissatisfaction and dysfunction, and yet fairly quickly he's consumed by the Yellow Vest protests, the Gilets jaunes protests. I think in his first year, at the end of his first year or so in office, as he tried to adopt various policies that they resisted, and pretty much ever since. And so even with his reelection, more recently, he's immediately 2 months later faced with an assembly in which he doesn't have a governing majority, showing again dissatisfaction with the major parties. They vote for him. 2 months later, they're voting for something different to control the National Assembly. Now, I don't know how much we want to get into the deep structural forces kind of driving this dissatisfaction, but I'll just highlight the two, in my view, the two major forces, which I think will be obvious to most of the listeners. But on the economic front, I think you have sort of a dynamic of two major contributors. First is globalization. And what we learned over time about the tremendous positive effect globalization had in lifting millions, hundreds of millions of people in China and India out of poverty. But the effect that had on the working classes, the income levels of the working classes and the middle classes of the West. I'm not sure how many of you have ever seen, there's one of the most famous curves in economic development is called the elephant curve, which basically shows the income share of different slices among the West, and the big slope down over the last 25, 30 years is, in the sort of the middle and slightly lower middle part of the distribution. There's been a kind of a wealth transfer that took place. In the US, for example, in the decade after China was admitted to the WTO, we lost 1/3 of all manufacturing jobs, which I think is an extraordinary figure. So you had that as a backdrop, and then 2008 and the financial crisis developed. And one of the interesting things academic studies show about financial crises is that the political reaction to them is very different than to economic recessions. So first of all, financial crises tend to be longer enduring than economic recessions. They take much longer to dig out of. But more importantly, people tend to blame the major financial kind of actors and institutions and the regulators for the crisis having happened. And governments have to typically do things like bail out these institutions to keep the economy from crashing even further. And that produces a lot of resentment and anger. And what we see in academic studies that look at the political aftermath of financial recessions, and I'm amazed someone put together a data set on this. They went back to 1870 and looked at all the financial crises that had occurred and then the political reactions, is you see a rise of about 30% in the vote share of populist type political parties driven by the kind of dynamic I'm talking about here. So that's kind of on the economic front. And then on the cultural front, the major issue, which has also been roiling the Western democracies, including in the US, is the immigration issue. And whatever one thinks about how that issue should be addressed, there's no question that it's been the second sort of major force driving this continual dissatisfaction among many people with what government is doing, the search for alternative parties, alternative ways of expressing this dissatisfaction. One way to put the larger point, or one way we see this expressed in the PR systems of Europe, is most of these systems since World War II until the last decade, although they were nominally multi-party systems, they really functioned as what we call 2.5 party systems. There was a dominant party of the left, a dominant party of the right. Sometimes they were able to govern on their own. Sometimes they needed a third party to form a governing majority. But they basically functioned as 2.5 party systems. And over the last decade, as we've seen in France, we see more generally that there's been alienation from those two major parties, from many, many voters, a search for alternative options, the rise of third and fourth parties. They may be on the left, they may be on the right, they may be a harder to characterize ideology, but many of these countries now function as 5 or 6 party democracies. They're much more fragmented than they had been ever since World War II. Germany is another kind of a good example of this. Germany had, between the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats, they typically got 90-some% of the vote for many, many decades. They were the dominant forces. That's largely collapsed. I think in the last election, or one of the last two, they come together, they got less than 50% of the vote. Germany now thinks of itself, or is described as a 6-party system. For the first time in its history, now it's governed by a 3-party coalition. In 2017, the prior election, it took longer to form a new government in Germany than at any time since World War II. The inability of these governments to come to terms with the economic and cultural stresses they face has led to this splintering of political authority, this, as I say, much more fragmented kind of politics. And sort of perversely, that's a reflection of all this dissatisfaction. And yet, in my view, it's also going to make it even harder for these governments to deliver effectively on these issues because they are much more fragmented. It's much more difficult to marshal significant kind of concerted authority for these governments to be able to take fairly, decisive actions. Now, to translate that into the US a little bit, since we have a 2-party system, these things don't get expressed in multi-party democracy, but I think we see much more internal fracturing or divisions or factions within our political parties, within the 2-party system. And I think that's kind of the way these forces get expressed here. And you see how much more difficult that makes it to govern in the US. So, even with, obviously, one party controls the US House, but it's been so fragmented internally that it's been fairly hard for the House to function in a decisive way for a significant period of time in recent years. You know, some pretty striking examples, even before Kevin McCarthy barely, being able to get elected as Speaker, when the Republicans were in charge of the House, they basically consumed two of their own speakers of the House. They threw out John Boehner. They basically made it impossible for Paul Ryan to stay in the Speaker's office, Speaker's chair. And that's because they have an internal faction. John Boehner described it as, an ungovernable caucus. So that's part of how you see these similar issues playing out in the US. And then let me make one last point. I mean, you opened up some very, very big issues here, and I'm sorry for kind of going on, but hopefully in the question period, people will home in on what they're most interested in. One of the profound changes in the way politics is organized now throughout the West is that as a result of the economic and cultural issues I've been describing, since World War II, the structure of politics had basically been that lower income and less educated voters tended to support the parties of the left, and more highly affluent, higher educated voters tended to support the parties of the right. And we have basically seen over the last decade or so a complete inversion of that. So that it is now the case that the parties of the left tend to attract more highly educated voters and to some significant extent the more affluent voters. And the parties of the right have become more the home of the less educated and less well-off voters. And this is, as profound a change in politics as you can imagine. I mean, this is really such a dramatic transformation. And I think part of the issue is the parties are trying to figure out how to deal with their new bases and their new coalitions. And that's a very important piece of the puzzle to understand here. Donald Trump kind of intuitively figured this out in the US before other Republican politicians had. And people forget when he ran in 2015, he, took Medicare and Social Security off the table. Those were, traditional Democratic Party issues. It was Republicans who wanted to do entitlement reform. And he said, I'm not going to touch your entitlements in those two areas. He took the positions on immigration. He took the positions on protectionism versus free trade. And this was all, whether, this was a carefully thought through strategy or something he just intuitively kind of grasped. But he really dramatically, he saw what was happening and dramatically accelerated that development in the US. And so that's part of the underlying structure of what's been happening with democracies over the last 10 to 15 years. And
Does the term populism in a sense represent, it's kind of ironic in a way that it's being adopted more by the right, which I think is consistent with your point. I mean, the popular interest has moved from the left to the right. And even the terminology, the messaging seems to be geared to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the term populism is a very kind of loose, term, and I'm not sure we have a great grasp of a precise way of how we really think about it. I think it's often used to describe politics you don't like or the other side or something like that. I mean, what I tend to think of with populism, when I try to be a little bit more precise about it, I think of it as, impatience with institutional sort of barriers or intermediary institutions that might stand between the direct expression of popular will and the implementation of policy by the single kind of leader figure. Impatience with courts, impatience with other kinds of traditional constraints on governmental power. Sometimes that comes from the left, sometimes it comes from the right. You know, in South America, populism has tended to be more from the left side. So I think it's a little, I mean, democracy always has some element of populism in it, and sort of understanding exactly what populism is it requires a little, precision in thinking, and we can talk more about that. But I often don't find it super helpful to use the terminology unless you're specifically talking about something like refusal to accept the constraints that the institutional arrangements of democracy impose on political power.
One other dimension that I think you're an expert in that we haven't talked about is the courts, the Supreme Court in the case of the U.S., but also the changes in the judiciary we've seen in countries like Hungary and Poland, where the executive branch has essentially managed to exercise greater control over what the courts can do and who's on the courts. Can you comment on your work with the Presidential Commission? So I know you were looking at options, but on the other hand, I don't think there was any recommendation that came out of it, nor am I aware of any actions that came from it. But what's your feeling as to the work that was done and what might be done with it?
Well, first on the larger point that you raised about courts, one of the things that we've discovered in this era in which we have seen some democratic backsliding in countries that had previously been democratic, is the rise of what's sometimes called electoral authoritarianism. And what we've discovered is that the threats to democracy these days no longer tend to take the form that we traditionally worried about, which is like military coups, throwing one government out and either taking power themselves, being ruled by a military junta, or putting in power a different regime. We have now seen governments that are legitimately elected in democratic processes, which then, once in power, try to leverage that power to emasculate the institutions that might put checks on their power. And the courts are the number one target. The independent media is another target, but the courts have become the first target in many of these regimes. So in Poland and Hungary, which have experienced the worst of this kind of democratic backsliding over the last decade or so, that was definitely one of the strategies of the Law and Justice Party in Poland, of Orban's government in Hungary. They have effectively taken control of the courts. We see in Israel now, of course, this tremendous battle taking place over the independence of the court. And again, notice it's one of the first pieces of legislation the newly elected Israeli government put on the table. Efforts to enable decisions of the court to be overruled by a simple majority vote in the Knesset. Fortunately, in the U.S., our system of independent judicial review is still very, very strong. But of course, there are lots of debates about the Supreme Court now, the legitimacy of the court, the increasingly aggressive tactics that are used in politics to try to deal with appointments, with vacancies, and the like, demands to expand the size of the court in response to some of those tactics. So when President Biden was asked about these issues when he was on the campaign trail, instead of immediately putting his hand up and saying, yes, I'm in favor of court packing, which was the way the issue was being pressed, and some of the Democratic candidates did come out in favor of that, he said, look, this is a very serious issue. I'm not going to take a position on it now. I'm going to appoint a commission to study not just that issue, but Supreme Court reform more generally. And I want this, studied in a serious way, not kind of in the midst of a partisan political campaign. So I was very honored to be appointed to that commission. The executive order that created us, told us not to make specific recommendations, but just to analyze the major reform proposals that are out there. One of the things we did analyze was ethics reform for the court, or the development of a code of ethics for the court. That obviously has come into much greater public focus over recent weeks with some of these recent disclosures that have taken place. But I'll stop. I'll make this last point, and then give people a chance, I think, maybe to weigh in. To me, the most interesting thing that emerged for me in the Supreme Court Commission's work was to learn how widespread the support was for shifting from lifetime tenure to fixed 18-year terms for the justices. And we are the only country, only major democracy that has lifetime tenure for its judges. Every other system either has mandatory retirement age at a certain point, or our judges serve for a fixed number of years. We've seen what's happened in the US with that system, which may have been the right way to set it up initially. But now we're in a world where these seats matter so much, given how powerful the court is as an institution, that the desire to appoint younger and younger justices has grown. People are healthier and they stay on the court longer. So the average term on the court was 15 years up until the 1970s. And the retirement since then, I think the average is up to over 25 years and probably continuing to grow. There's also tremendous randomness in how appointments arise in our system. It depends on the vagaries of when people die or retire. That means that some presidents get no appointments in a 4-year term now. Some presidents, like Donald Trump, get 3 appointments in a 4-year term. And it's really hard to give any rationale for that kind of randomness in the system. If the system was designed to reflect to some extent larger, political, cultural, electoral kind of dynamics, by making the president and the Senate the key actors in the appointments process, it's very hard to understand any rationale for the arbitrariness of some presidents having no appointments, some having 3. With these fixed 18-year terms, every president would have 2 nominations in every 4-year term. So it would regularize that process. And it would mean people would serve no longer than 18 years, which I think is probably a healthy thing, instead of having people serve for 35 or 40 years on the court. Now, changing the structure of the court is you're talking about changing a major institution of government. And I never expected any change of that sort to take place in the short term. And I don't know whether it'll take place in the longer term. But I think the commission lays out more fully than has ever been done before the arguments for and against making this move, and what it would look like to make this move. And my hope is that over time there's more discussion of these issues, and the report gets looked to as those discussions take place. So we've ranged pretty broadly here, Mike, but I hope that's enough to get people motivated with any questions they might want to pursue.
Okay, let's open it up for questions now, and see if there's some people in the audience that have either some comments or questions they'd like to add to the discussion. I see that Seth Radwell has raised his hand. You can unmute yourself, and Herb can maybe spotlight you, and we can get you into the discussion.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for doing this. And I'm a big fan, Professor Pildes, of your work. So I really appreciate you taking this time. I've done a lot of research in this area. And one of the core questions I wanted to run by you is there's a problem in our traditional paradigm of left-right partisan politics that we've used for the last nth number of years regarding the role of government in the market and kind of the traditional left-right split. It's much more, to me, in my view, there's a first-order conflict about where the locus of authority for governing is located, whether it's located, with elites who, to a lot of the points you made, or the people. And there's no question that since the global neoliberalistic paradigm has hurt a lot of the working class, there's a huge amount of resentment. So my question is, to what degree is the first order conflict no longer about policy issues like immigration or economic or welfare, but much more about how our system should be balanced? Now, the irony to me of this, I'll shut up in 1 second, is that this goes back to, in my thesis in my book, the original American schism, which is the Enlightenment contention between what became the Federalists and the Jeffersonian Republicans. And so, in fact, there's so much to learn from history about how we've balanced this elite versus populist view. So I just wanted to get your take on that.
Yeah, it's a very, very interesting set of questions. Thanks for coming. I appreciate it. And your nice comments about my work. That's a surprise. I think most people are motivated by the substantive issues. What is the economy doing for me? Are my kids likely to have better prospects than I do? What's happening in my schools, my communities, and the like. And then these other debates about levels of authority kind of come into that discussion. But I don't think I don't know that I think those issues about authority are sort of first order as opposed to more second order. In other words, I think if people were satisfied with what government was producing, they would be less concerned about how the decision-making power is being allocated. They still would have some concern, to be sure. So I think that both of these are implicated, of course, but when people are dissatisfied, I mean, one of the things we see with the alienation from the traditional parties throughout the West is a lot of these insurgent parties are demanding more direct participatory involvement, whether they're parties on the left or the right. This is sort of an interesting development. And in fact, it's often the parties of the right that are demanding referenda now. Brexit, of course, was done through a referendum. So I think when there's dissatisfaction, you do see it get expressed through these kinds of demands for changes of decision-making. And I think your larger point is right. I mean, I think a democracy is always, in the US especially, a tension between the role of what we might want to call political elites, political leadership, and the sort of the popular kind of element in the system. And when the system doesn't seem to be functioning very well, there's pressure to kind of move in one direction or the other. I mean, one of the things I would point out to you about the US is one of the most radical changes we made to our system in the direction of more direct participation was the decision in the 1970s to get rid of the convention system, basically, in which party figures from throughout the country had a major say in who the nominees for the presidency were, and go to the system of primaries, which is a pure populist system for choosing a party leader. And I think that one of the consequences of that change and of that kind of populism in terms of institutional design, I think it does raise the risk of more demagogic type figures capturing the nomination of a major party and therefore potentially the presidency.
Yeah.
So that's a long answer, but those are really rich questions.
Thank you. I think, Mike, you're muted.
Sorry, I think Frank Langford has a question or comment to make, if he can unmute and speak.
Yes, thanks very much for doing this. I appreciate it. Professor, I have a couple of questions. One is, are you seeing, as you look at the sort of illiberal playbook that's designed to undermine democratic institutions. Are you seeing any sort of interesting and concerning innovations? Things that we should be looking at in the next few election cycles to kind of watch out for? That's one question. And then the second one is, I think at the beginning of the conversation, I think people asked, do you think that illiberal democratic, attempts to undermine, norms and checks and balances, we've seen a lot of that in the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years, I suppose. Do you think that that is now in retreat to some degree? Or do you think it's a lull? I know this is almost an impossible question and to answer, so no one will hold you to an answer. But I think it's an interesting one because we see these sort of, we've seen some signs in the last 18 months of some of these attempts actually falling a bit flat. One example would be, to some degree, the midterms. So thanks for taking the question. I appreciate it.
So on that second question, I think that we've seen some positive signs. For example, in Brazil, when Bolsonaro was up for re-election, there, I think it was widespreadly shared, that was an awkward way of putting it. The view was pretty widespread that if he lost and it was relatively close, he would refuse to leave. He would, pull out this playbook of how to stay in power, various claims about election fraud and all of that. And he didn't do that. He made a minor effort eventually, but that was not really a serious effort. And that election held, and he was successfully removed from office. And I think that's a positive development. Turkey is about to have elections now for the first time in a long time since he's been in power. It looks like there may be real competition for Erdogan there, and we'll see what happens there. But there are other, kind of concerning developments. There's been in Italy, for example, a far right party is now in charge of government there. We'll see, how democratically they govern or don't. But I think it's a little bit more of a lull. I think it's too early to judge and proclaim some kind of victory. I think the Ukraine war in this context is an interesting thing to think about as well, because that sort of re-emergence of external threat, or kind of really traditional great power conflict, can create more solidarity, as it has kind of within the West, including within individual kinds of countries. And that can push back against some of these forces of fragmentation. Anyway, on the first question, in the US, the kinds of things I'm worried about in terms of our institutions, we have a system in which a lot of the election administration is done by volunteers. They had been relatively obscure, which was good. They did their jobs. They've now come under, in some states, awful, tremendous threats, pressure, harassment, intimidation. The very good director of elections in Maricopa, Arizona, Maricopa County in Arizona, Phoenix, Bill Gates, who I think is a person of considerable integrity in administering their elections, recently said he now has PTSD from what he's had to be gone through and his family in the last several years. A lot of these people are leaving office. We also elect a lot of the officials who oversee our elections. Again, these positions were not so high profile. As it's become more apparent the kind of power they may have, we've seen more partisan activist types run for some of these offices. So I think, there's reason to worry about the election administration apparatus and how much integrity they'll be able to maintain in future elections. So I think it's a good thing that some of the most prominent people who denied the legitimacy of the voting process in their states did not get elected to office in our most recent elections. That's a positive development, but I think, I don't view us as out of the woods yet on that.
Okay, well, I think we've reached the formal time limit of our call. I would like to conclude with one off the wall question for Professor Pildes, based on an article he wrote, I think it was in 2015 or 16, about the ambiguities that might result in if the president were elected between the November election date and the actual inauguration date on January 20th. Given the age of the two possible candidates that are running for office right now, what exactly could go wrong there?
So this is funny. In 2020, in the run up to the election, the Washington Post asked me, they did a couple of interviews with me on all the scenarios to worry about, given the age of both Joe Biden and Donald Trump. This was for 2020. What happens if a candidate becomes unable to serve before Election Day, between Election Day and the meeting of the Electoral College, between the meeting of the Electoral College and Inauguration Day? And I went through all of those scenarios. The Washington Post told me that was the most cited story that year in the particular part of the paper that they featured it, because there was so much anxiety about these issues in 2020. We're going to see that again probably in 2024 if it's a rematch. To be honest, I don't remember all the intricacies off the top of my head. I'd have to go back and look, for each of those periods to remind myself what rule structure we have in place. I'll just say this. One of the points of vulnerability is after Election Day, before the electors meet, if a candidate who's won the vote in a state dies, what do the electors do in that state? Do they have discretion to vote for someone else? Are they still obligated to vote for that person even though they're dead? Some state laws are already in place to deal with that situation. Ideally, we would want every state to have a law for how to address that situation. But we're lucky that we've never actually had any of these scenarios arise where the presidency would actually turn on the answer.
We have one last question, I think, from Peter Cyrus. Peter?
I just wanted to make a comment. We haven't had a case where the presidency would change, but we have had a case where one of the two major party candidates died between the election day and the day of the Electoral College met, and that was Horace Greeley,
Right.
in 1872.
Right.
And if you look at the Electoral College votes, I mean, obviously Greeley wasn't going to win, but they were a mess in 1872. So it is reasonable to assume that it would be a mess this year. The one thing that they couldn't do was you would think that if the president died, the vice president would then get the electoral votes from the state that the president won, but that was not the case in 1872.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you very much, Rick. And I'm going to turn it back to Kate to do the final wrap up and the meeting.
Sure. So I just want to thank our distinguished speakers, Richard H. Pildes and Michael Otten, for your time and for sharing your insights and expertise with us. Thank you also to the participants in this virtual session who posted such thoughtful questions. We appreciate your interaction. We also welcome your feedback on this session and your suggestions for future discussions. Thank you again and have a nice evening or afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. Bye.
Thanks to you too.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.